Good morning, YouTube. Sunday, the 30th of July. Just getting ready for the roundtable discussion.
Word of the moment, isn't it? And for many, rising inequality defines the economic times. Remember last year's presidential primaries for the Democrats? It was the potent rallying call for Bernie Sanders, wasn't it? And of course, Jeremy Corbyn, the left-wing Labor leader in Britain. And indeed, it was the heart of all people, Donald Trump. His promise to return jobs and wealth to America's forgotten working class, particularly in those Rust Belt states up north. Well, here, a furious political debate has erupted, and that's followed Bill Shorten's promise that tackling inequality would be his defining mission if Labor wins the next election.
Inequality kills hope. It feeds that sense, that resentment, that the deck is stacked against ordinary people, that the fix is in, the deal is done. The workers' share of income is at its lowest level in half a century. Tackling inequality will be a defining mission for a Shorten Labor government.
With Labor opposition leader Bill Shorten, now the Treasurer, Scott Morrison, he hit back saying there's now less inequality.
This idea that people and inequality in incomes has been going in the wrong direction, that's not borne out by the facts. It hasn't got worse, the inequality, it's actually got better.
So the question here is, what defines inequality? Is it just about an income gap? And in Australia, is it reality or perception? Well, that's our topic for this morning's Sunday Roundtable debate. We've got a great debate. Economics writer and columnist with The Guardian, Greg Jericho. G'day, Greg.
G'day.
Great to be with you again. And Professor Emeritus in Sociology at La Trobe University, John Carroll. Now, his forthcoming book, Land of the Golden Cities, Australia's Exceptional Prosperity and the Culture That Made It. Now, that looks at the nature of inequality and prosperity from both an economic and cultural perspective. John, it's great to be in touch again.
Thanks, Tom.
Greg, let's start with you. You just heard the Labor leader, Bill Shorten. He says that, quote, workers' share of income is at its lowest level in half a century. Is he right?
Yes, using the measure that he's using, which is the share of GDP, that goes to workers, which is known as compensation of employees, as a share of national income is lowest it's been since I think it was 50 years we're talking, and the drop that it's seen in the last 12 months is a faster drop than has ever been recorded.
Okay, so is that workers' share of income being at its lowest level, is that an accurate measure of growing inequality?
No, not particularly. You can't define inequality just by the share of income going to workers. It's because it's essentially measuring where's the income going. Is it going to profits or is it going to wages and salaries? Now, it doesn't automatically follow that if it's the share going to workers is declining, that means the inequality is rising. But it is one of those sort of warning signs, I guess. But one of the problems with that is it's something that has been happening for 30 years. We've really, since the 80s, that share has been declining. And another good measure of how much of national income is going to workers that we use is a thing called the real unit labour costs. And that has certainly been falling as well since the 1980s. So you can't immediately say, oh, it's gone down, therefore inequality's gone up. But it's a good indicator that we should be looking at this issue a bit closer.
Now, John takes a different view, I believe. You argue, John, that there is less income inequality now, that in the past 20 or so years, incomes have become more equal. Is that your argument, essentially?
Well, a clearer view of inequality is it's sort of obvious, the difference between the best off and the worst off, and that's measured very, very accurately in this country by the Hilda surveys that come out of the Melbourne Institute, which they're very high-quality social research. I mean, I've been using them for years, and I actually don't know any better quality of social research anywhere else in the world. And they've shown that if we look at the the top 10% in terms of income and the bottom 10% in terms of income, the difference between the two has not increased since 2000. In other words, the gap between the best off 10% and the worst off 10% is not increasing. In fact, it's slightly contracting, but that's negligible.
So to the extent that you're right, that doesn't seem to fit with Bill Shorten's assertion that workers' share of income is at its lowest level in half a century, correct?
Well, I think he's completely wrong. It's just factually incorrect. Plus the fact that if you look at the OECD, the 34 best developed countries in the world, Australia's got the highest minimum wage in the OECD. It's got the lowest gap between the minimum wage and the average wage, people in the middle. In other words, inequality, and that's a pretty good measure too. Is the least in the developed countries. Now, comparing us with like is a realistic social, economic, and cultural assessment of where this country is at, and. Of course, there are specific areas of inequality. We all know this: housing prices in the big cities, transport on the fringes of the big cities. But if we stand back and look at the big picture, inequality is not the major problem for this country.
Yeah, Greg, John's mentioned this, Hilda. This is the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey, what we have here. There is also internationally the Gini coefficient that measures income distribution and poverty. Now, both suggest a reduction in income inequality in this country since 2001. Aren't they an accurate indication?
Well, the Gini measure isn't a different thing to the Hilda report. The Hilda report it calculates the Gini coefficient. So does the ABS. And you're right. The Hilda report, which starts from 2001, does suggest it's been basically flat, perhaps a little bit up or a little bit down. The ABS has its own Gini coefficient measure, and as you can imagine, actually measuring national income at different percentiles isn't a perfectly exact science, so they do differ a little bit. The ABS's measure is a little bit flat, but perhaps has gone up a bit. But the overarching point, and this is, I think, where Scott Morrison is kind of focused on, is this sense of thinking in a pretty short term of just, since the last 10 years or so, whereas Shorten's argument, and the one I would make as well, is that what we're seeing here, looking at, is a long-term thing. If we compare it to the 80s, if we compare it to the 1970s, 1980s, inequality has risen. It was something Philip Lowe, the governor of the Reserve Bank, said just this week. He said that certainly it has risen over the past 30 years. It hasn't risen too much recently. He said it's gone up just a little bit, whereas there's this income equality, whereas wealth inequality has been the huge increase in the past decade or so. So I just, I don't know of anyone who is arguing that inequality is worse now than it was in the 1980s. And whether it's worse now than it was in 2005 or 2010 is getting a little bit split hairs thing, and in my view it's a little bit arguing whether the temperature of the climate has increased in the last 5 years and whether or not that proves climate change is real. If we look at the long term has certainly been increasing.
Well, John, you say that employment's the main game, and clearly recent employment growth in this country has been extraordinary. I mean, we tend to forget these things, but we haven't had a recession in 25 years. We've had the longest spat of uninterrupted growth, I think, more than any other country. But Greg, and Greg's not alone here. You'll read this a lot in The Guardian, The Herald, The Age, the Saturday paper, Black Ink books, all that. They will argue that while worker productivity has risen, real wages have fallen. So there's a growing feeling that even in work, people are going backwards. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's not borne out comparatively. If you look through, as I've just quoted from the Hilda surveys, if you look across the work spectrum, if that were true, you'd expect the 10% at the top of the income scales to be drawing ahead of the rest. It's just not true, and I think it shifts focus away from what's a lot more important if we're talking about the medium to the long term, which I agree we should be, which is producing new wealth, new jobs, new prosperity. I mean, if we are looking back over the last 20 or 30 years, between roughly 2000 and 2012, we had a huge income growth in this country, probably the biggest in the nation's history, with the possible exception of the gold rushes. Now that's what makes people a lot better off. And if we look into the future, I don't think we should be focusing on current inequality, lack of it, or areas where it exists, but how we're going to continue to create this dynamic economy. And that's going to depend on things like, I'm sure Shorten's interested in this, in education, the quality of our education institutions. The future of this country is going to depend on knowledge industries. And for that, we need excellent universities and schools.
Greg, earlier this morning, we spoke with the American economist Pippa Malmgren, and the point she made about inequality, I thought was interesting, that rising inequality could be an unintended consequence of the stimulus measures put in place during the financial crisis. This is what she said.
When governments throw record sums of money at the economy, which we did in the form of the so-called quantitative easing, record low interest rates, what it does is it makes asset prices go up. That means the stock market and house prices, and who owns those things? The people that actually already were in the game. So they benefit in a way bigger way than the people who don't own assets. And that's why we feel this separation.
Now, that was Pippa Malmgren talking with me this morning, Greg. Now, if you just look at the US economy, Barack Obama, when he came to power in early 2009, he inherited a deep recession, obviously. But in a way, you could argue that that sluggish economic growth we've seen in the United States, it's 1% to 2%, maybe 2% growth average since the recession ended, that makes it all the more dismaying because they've put in all this stimulus and whatnot, and income redistribution was a big agenda in Washington during the Obama era, and yet you've had slower growth and more inequality in the United States.
Well, certainly that's always been one of the issues that many progressives have taken with the type of stimulus measures that are focused on monetary policy, of cutting interest rates to essentially nothing, which is what happened in America, and even here in Australia with cutting interest rates to the record lows that we now see them. Because what does that do? It as Pippa says there, it encourages people to invest in houses. It causes asset prices to rise. Doesn't have so much of an effect on income equality as such. It really has that focus on wealth equality, because wealth is all about how many assets you own and the value of them. And certainly that's what we see. We see increases in asset prices, and we've seen that in Australia, mostly in Sydney, not so much the rest of the nation. And that's why, if I was and I've always been more in favour of stimulus measures that are more coming from the government, of fiscal, and relate to infrastructure spending, or spending, as John says, on education aspects and things like that, that have more long-term, aren't so much geared towards just stimulating asset prices and getting people to keep buying things in a sense of hoping that that will keep the economy buoyant.
Yeah, well, I mean, John, many free market economists would say that in a tight labour market, employers expand benefits to compete for workers, and that's why a growing economy is the best antidote to inequality. And yet we have this problem with housing affordability, especially in Sydney and Melbourne. John, is housing affordability here skewing the perception of inequality?
If it's impacting on you, yes, of course it is, and it is a major problem in this country. But it's a specific problem, like the lack of transport infrastructure on the edges of Sydney and Melbourne is a specific problem. Whereas at the macro levels, which is this discussion has been mainly about that, as we stand back, I think it's very different. And the United States is a very, very different case. I mean, inequality in the macro sense, I think, is a huge problem in the United States. I mean, the statistic that shocks me is that the median real wage has not increased in the United States in the last 40 years. And people are not better off on the average in the United States than 40 years ago. Now that means that there's now low social mobility. There's now the land of opportunity has become the land of basically stagnant opportunity.
Yeah, but John, would you say that the big spending stimulus policies of Barack Obama and Capitol Hill Democrats, that was obviously designed to maintain jobs and grow the economy during the financial crisis, did that lead to increased inequality?
There we go on the upload limit. Back immediately.